This week on the Documentary Review Podcast, we skate to the height of the mountain where we taste the glory, and then we go down to the depths where we face our own destruction as we review the 2014 documentary All This Mayhem. Welcome to the Documentary Review Podcast. I am PT.
And I'm Jonathan. Glad you're here.
Glad you're here as well. How's it going, Jonathan?
It's going good. I think we picked a good documentary for this week. I don't know. Hopefully you agree or disagree. Either way, it'll be interesting.
We'll find out. Well, let's start with that. At the very beginning, our new technique, ever since we didn't realize that we had differing opinions on the film till the end of the episode, is to say if we give it just overall a thumbs up or thumbs down. So what do you say to this one, Jonathan?
Thumbs up for me on this one.
Thumbs up for me as well. I was kind of hoping you'd go thumbs down on this just because, that would have been a good discussion. But all right, fine. 2 thumbs up. We're in. So we'll let you do your summary in a minute. But before we get to that, I was just wondering, does watching this documentary at all, particularly like the first little maybe 20 minutes, make you wish you had skateboarded at all in your young days?
No, it definitely made me nostalgic. I definitely like the old school handheld VHS recording, shots and stuff like that, and the crappy video kind of, and the everything about it brought me back to my youth. But yeah, no, I was not regretful. It didn't make me think, boy, I wish I would have skateboarded a lot when I was a kid.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I think skateboarding is one of those really few. There's really not that many things like this, but it's one of those things that when you're you can't really take it up when you're in your mid-30s. Your time has passed.
Yeah, you would be the odd man out on the skate park, putting on your first pair of pads and buying a skateboard right now.
And also the first time you fell, and you're like, I'm out for 6 weeks because I fell.
Right? Don't you miss the days when your bones just seem to bend and just snap back, and you're
right.
Take monster falls off stuff when you're a kid, and not so much anymore.
No. All right. Well, enough of that. Set us up for this documentary.
All right. Documentary focuses on 2 brothers who take up skateboarding in the very late 80s, early 90s. Young, underprivileged brothers from Australia. They get into skateboarding. They do extremely well. Follows their ascent to the top of the profession. They're ranked number 1 and 2 in the world at one point. And then it also follows their demise through a series of bad choices, mostly related to drugs and alcohol. Basically, their whole world comes crashing down, and it's kind of following that journey. And then tons of great underlining that come along with that as well, like the notion of fate, because essentially, like I said, it's 2 underprivileged kids from Australia, and kind of bad section of town. If you said those 2 kids grow up, they go to jail and bad things happen to them, and they end up the way they end up, you'd say that totally makes sense. What makes the story interesting is their ascent to stardom and this pinnacle of a sport that happens kind of out of the blue and still doesn't change anything. But anyway, that's All This Mayhem in a nutshell.
Yeah.
You guys had a chance to watch it this weekend.
Yeah, no, it was a good setup, and I'll I already said I gave it a thumbs up, but I'll be honest, for the first about 15-20 minutes of it, maybe not even that long, maybe 10 minutes of it, when it was just them as kids skateboarding, I was like, oh my god, this documentary's gonna suck, because it was because I had no idea what to expect of this. I just had read the synopsis that it was some brothers skateboarding who got into drug use or whatever, so I was like, man, maybe we're gonna get 100 minutes of skateboarding and then 10 minutes of drug use at the end. But no, this story definitely took some wild and crazy turns that kept me on the edge of my seat, even as a non-skateboarding aficionado.
Right, absolutely. I also am not a skateboarding aficionado by any means. In fact, know very little about skateboarding other than I played Tony Hawk's video games and know some skateboarders through that. But yeah, no, it held my interest on a lot of different levels. There were a lot of little a lot of nuances to this. I mean, because like I said, the overall thing is definitely just following their journey on skating, but there's a lot of little pieces to this documentary that I thought were just, I don't know, just very cool and very deep, that just happened to be part of it, just by following these brothers and seeing. Like, the other cool thing about skateboarding that made this documentary very cool was it's one of their friends just filmed skateboarding, and everywhere they went they were filming skateboarding, which happened to document the lives of these two brothers for countless amounts of hours of footage throughout their entire lives to that point, which really made for a great documentary, and you got to see these little pieces of how they progressed and parts of their lives that you never would have seen, because essentially the documentary spanned 30 years more or less. Started in 80, yeah, something like that. Not quite 30 years, but anyway, a long time.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of like, just to summarize a little bit of the beginning, because I don't really have too much to say about the first little part. It starts off and shows them when they're, coming up in Australia as kids, and they go to the skate park, and they're really tough and stuff like that. Oh, actually, I do have one thing to say about that. How about that scene where they were talking about their jiu-jitsu class?
Yep, I got notes on that.
That was messed up. So they go to the jiu-jitsu class that was like taught by their dad and uncle, first of all, and then their uncle's like motivational technique before like sparring matches would be like, "All right, your mother's being raped. What are you gonna do? Your mother's gonna die any second. What are you gonna do? Go!" And then he like sent the kids at each other. I was like, "Holy cow, that's pretty intense."
Right, and they're talking about the first thing they taught these little like kids are all the pressure points, like eyes, throat, back of the ears, like up the nose, all that stuff. Is like all these kill moves. I was like, but and then like the again, this is where I think like the nuances of the film, like things, the documentary that you can really sink your teeth into, is also brought up in this, because they go out and they say like they were in America we would call them white trash. They call them boogans, I think was the name for it for Australia. But that these kids were underprivileged kids. They didn't come from much money. They came from a dysfunctional family. He tells a story about he thought his dad was gonna like slap around his mom, so he got in between them, and then his mom came out of the kitchen with a glass ashtray and just smashed it over his dad's head. He's like knocked unconscious, bleeding in the living room. That's kind of like Saturday night to these kids. You know what I mean? They came from a pretty dysfunctional home. And again, like I thought of that, like to me at least, what was the mistake where they essentially turned out exactly the way you thought they would have, except for the part where they did become really successful in a lot of different ways briefly, and then they just boomeranged right back into where you thought two kids with that kind of a background would end up.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess if you look at it that way, from the perspective of this is where they're going to end up no matter what, pretty good. They did a pretty good job. They had a good, at least they had like a lot of fun in between.
They sure did. They had a great ride in the middle. So.
All right. So anything else from their like early childhood before they like head off to America?
Yeah. No. Like the only other like big event like that I thought was just crazy was so in '89 they would have been at that was their first professional tour. And they call it a pro tour or whatever, a skateboarding tour, but it sounded like it was a pretty small scale kind of an Australian thing. But it was in '89, so there's two brothers that this focused on, Ben and Toss. And Ben was 11 years old and Toss was 14. So like they don't mention their ages in it, but they just said, yeah, and we were kids in '89, and they looked really young. I was like, well, what the heck? So at the end of it, I looked up their ages, their birth dates, and did the math and all that. So they were 11 and 14 when they went on that first tour. And the first tour, yeah, we go on the skateboarding tour, and these guys are doing cocaine and getting drunk and messing around with girls. I was like, oh yeah, 11-year-old doing that. seems like it could have a lot of effect on him,
Right.
I don't think they were really partaking. They didn't seem, maybe Toss was, but it didn't seem like they were really partaking in the drugs in that first tour, but they're certainly very exposed to it.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
and
So don't let your kids go on skateboarding tour. That's
right,
my advice.
right, and then the other thing that I took away from that, like the other little note, was how cool and innocent Ben seemed, like as a
Mm.
kid. He seemed like a really good kid. He was like, Toss was certainly like the, you know, adrenaline filled, like adrenaline junkie, and just wanted to get into trouble and cause mischief. But it certainly seemed like Ben was, even when he spoke on camera, he was very even keel and just seemed like a decent kid. And you know, it was just crazy to see his progression throughout the film.
Totally. Yeah,
Um,
no, that's a great point. He was, and also this was about the point in the film where I noticed, man, they sure are having Toss talk a lot, and I've not heard a lot of like current modern day voiceovers for Ben in this part.
yeah, that was actually the like right away in the film, the first time that you hear Ben speak, and they've got they show him in the skate ramp and wherever in Australia, and they say, and in the little corner it says caption voice of Ben Pappas, and right then I was like, ooh, like my first thought was either he's in jail or he's dead,
Right.
So like right away I was like, ooh, doesn't bode well for him that he can't be there to be part of the documentary,
All right.
which is
For sure.
yeah.
Um, Yeah, so before we get back into it, I forgot to mention at the beginning, and I wanted for any of our live viewers that we do have the Q&A open. So if you're watching on Google Plus, you should be able to enter a question or comment if you want, and we will see it magically appear in front of us through the magic of Google. All right, so then Tass just goes to America with apparently, I mean, the way they made it sound was he just like went to America with like the little money he had with no plan, no place to stay or nothing. And strangely enough, it works out pretty well for him. He finds a place to skateboard and starts skateboarding nonstop and gets pretty darn good and starts making waves on the U.S. scene.
Yeah, yeah. Also, doesn't take any time for him to jump into the drug scene as well, with skating. Because like one thing that I don't know if you ever heard this, Ty, but when I was growing up, when I was in like high school, early college, when like drugs were like at least part of life. I mean, not that I was big into drugs or anything, but at least like it was part of culture, and like you knew people that did drugs. But there was always this like rumor that if you dropped acid like 13 times, I can't remember what the number was, but it was pretty low, 13 or 20 times or something like that, you'd go insane. And then
Yeah,
that was like,
7 was the rumor I always heard, I think.
okay, yeah, I remember it being really low, like in the low teens or something like that. But so I always thought like, oh yeah, you drop acid, a couple times, you go insane. So Toss goes to America, goes to Florida, and hangs out at the skate ramp, and he says he was on acid for a year. So I would assume that he meant like every single day, more or less, probably multiple times per day, the way he talked and mentioned it, that he was dropping acid. So kind of put that urban myth to rest.
Yeah, and he seemed like I mean, I'm not going to say he like had his head on straight necessarily, but when they were interviewing him, but he was articulate enough and everything like that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. 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 I think like people totally underestimate the resilience of the human body. And I mean, there's countless number of rock stars that are living proof of this. Not that I want to encourage drug use among anyone, but you got Mick Jagger, and if you see a interview with Mick Jagger today, he's like, he's again articulate. He knows what's going on. He's not like,
Right.
And yeah, and that guy's obviously done an insane amount of drugs. And same with this guy. He's did amount of drugs that were just mind-boggling. And even at that point in that skate park when they're broke and they're just dropping acid all day and skating, that's pretty much what he spent a year doing: acid and skating.
Yes, winning combo. So then pretty soon, it wasn't long, I don't think, before his little brother Ben came over and joined in on the skating scene, and that was in Florida. And I don't know how long it was, but eventually they moved to San Diego, which is kind of the skateboarding mecca, where all the biggest
Yep,
skateboarders hang out.
yep. That let's see. So it was yeah, 89 through 93 is when oh no, actually that was kind of the gap. So 93 is when Toss went to Tampa, and they had to wait 2 years. So Ben, I think, was 2 years younger than Toss, or 3 years younger. But that was the other thing that seemed crazy to me. So Toss had to finish 10th grade, and so did Ben. So with a sophomore in high school, both of them, that was the farthest they took their education. That was funny because like he went over to America, and then Ben had to wait until he hit that same. He was like, oh, then finally I hit 10th grade, so I could go over to America and follow Toss over there or whatever. So that was the extent of their education. Not exactly spectacular. Like, I don't know if that's like an Australian thing or what, or like you don't have to actually finish high school to be eligible to drop out and whatever. Anyway, so they're still young, and they, yeah. Uh,
Um,
uh,
so somewhere I don't remember the dude's name, but um, I didn't write it down or anything. But you know that one dude who was like basically just mad at the current state of skating and was like all super pissed
yeah,
off and did
I
whatever
didn't get
that
his
guy.
name either, but yeah, he
Um,
was he was
yeah, that guy was funny. But oh, actually no, it wasn't him. I totally lied. But one of the other dudes had a good quote where he's like, um, Toss wasn't like I don't think he was like trying to be mean or anything. He's just a natural asshole. I wrote that down. I thought that was pretty
yeah,
good.
that was
Good
the
quote.
yeah that was pretty funny too, and that was the guy that owned XYZ, and it was
Yeah,
that was a cute thing too because it's one of those things where you can see time heals all wounds, where like both you can see Toss and that guy obviously at one point hated each other, like had like the guy tried to like throw a Molotov cocktail on his roof and burn his house down. That's pretty, you don't like somebody too much if you're doing that.
right.
And then you could tell. I bet you could put those two in the same room together today, where they'd be like, "Yeah, it was a bummer that we, tried to kill each other and hated each other and all that." But how you been? Because I mean, at one point they were friends. I think they could be friends again.
Right.
But
Sure. Um, so one thing about this documentary, I feel like, is it's like if you're in your 30s or probably 40s, you remember well the VH1 Behind the Musics and the E True Hollywood Stories, which basically always followed the exact same arc, where it was some celebrity or musician who rose to fame and then had trouble, and then like miraculously when they decide to film these, they are always like just rise to their peak. They've overcome all their problems. Holy cow! And like obviously time has shown that that is not necessarily true for many of the people. They just like created a little Hollywood ending for those episodes. But I feel like this was like the more realistic version of those, because you had the characters who kind of followed that arc at the beginning, their rise and fall, but then like every time they would, and this is definitely getting ahead of where we are, but uh, every time they would like kind of start to rise, it would be like, they'd show a quote being like, yeah, and that's when I turned my life around. And then no, that was not when they turned their life around. Things would like just fall apart even more at that point. So I just thought that was interesting the way it kind of followed that behind the music arc, but in a more realistic way, where they basically proved there was no happy ending for these type of guys.
right, and I also think that like what you just touched on there was another one of those little nuances to the documentary that really I just found fascinating. So Toss, is talking throughout the documentary, and there, like you said, there's a lot of instances where he says either that's where we made it, or he's like, yeah, that's where it started to fall apart. But like, it was amazing to me to see how far off he was on that statement. Every time he made it, anytime he was like, yeah, it was when Ben got arrested, and that's when things started to go down. It's like, no, that's when that's when it caught up with you. But you could tell, like as a person, he didn't realize that no, things had been going downhill long before that. There had been all these like chains of events and choices that he had made too. I mean, it was all based on his decisions, like this, tremendous amount of drug use and not respecting other people and a million different things he had done that had all led to these other events. But he didn't. You could tell even today, where he still doesn't understand or see where things went wrong. You know, his version of where things went wrong is way too late. It's like, dude, you gotta. That's not where things went wrong. That's where things got, you got caught up. Like things actually got caught on you. You fell apart or whatever. But where things went wrong were a lot of steps before that, and it was interesting to see someone that just like I truly believe just watching it, like he didn't understand even to this day what the real problems were, what the root of things going wrong were, and it was just a cool, I don't know, insight into how people perceive themselves and the lack of understanding we have of our own circumstances. So.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I want to get back to that for sure. But I kind of took us off track in the narrative a little bit. So like after they moved to California, they really start rising to the top, and they are, like competing with Tony Hawk for the #1 spot in a lot of tournaments and stuff like that. So here's my question that we've asked this question of many a documentary, Jonathan, because they never seem to get too specific about the money in any documentaries. So I'm really curious, like, because these guys came from so little, like, how much money were they actually making? Because they like played it off in the documentary like they were just like rolling in wealth or whatever. But they did show like the biggest tournament they ever won was also like $10,000, which, obviously that's not nothing, but it's not $1 million either, like kind of the way they made it sound. And obviously that wasn't their only income. I'm sure they got less money from sponsorships. But I have no clue like what the actual amount of money they had was.
Right, agreed. So like you're saying, so they go like 1996 was their year. That was the year that both Toss and Ben and are winning all these world championship skating things, and so there's like a ranking system for the year, and they end up being ranked 1 and 2, and the pinnacle of that is Toss winning the world championships, which, like you said, he gives them 10 grand. They're also sponsored, but like I was watching that too because he was like, yeah, I thought the money would never stop all that, but I think the money was really little. I mean, like I think they were taken care of in a way, like because obviously like they had no business sense. They weren't like signing contracts. They weren't like preparing for the future. I think that their sponsors were kind of paying for their apartments, kind of a thing. They had some actual money that they were getting paid from their sponsors and things like that. And obviously the tournament winnings were a little bit of money. But yeah, I got the feeling that like all that money was very little money. 50, 60 grand
Right.
plus some expenses. But yeah, to them, I think it obviously seemed like a lot of money.
Yeah.
And they were taking, yeah, I mean,
good.
I was gonna say, and to party a lot, like the way they partied. Although they did seem to spend a lot of money on cocaine. I mean, there had to be a lot of money spent on that. But there didn't seem like there was much money for any other living expenses for them. They didn't have anything. They just partied and skated. Just two things.
Right. Another interesting thing that so along this time frame is their total animosity for Tony Hawk, which as a skating outsider, like I did not know that animosity towards Tony Hawk existed, and they are definitely have some animosity. And I asked one of our friends, Andy, who's a big skateboarding fan, about this. I'll tell you what he said in a minute. But what was your thoughts of the whole Tony Hawk feud?
Well, I'm on pins and needles to hear what Andy had to say about it. But I wrote down in my notes. Yes, they really hated Tony Hawk, and it seemed crazy to me because they were kind of like, he's mainstreaming skating, and I get where they were at polar opposites because, Toss and Ben were just like this force. They were just adrenaline and anger, and then there's just kind of what they were made of, and they fed off it, and that was what skating was to them. And Tony Hawk certainly like mainstreamed the crap out of, he was the poster child for mainstreaming skating. On the other hand, but I mean, the flip side of that is as an outsider, I like Tony Hawk. I'm a fan of him. He always seems cool, like cool dude. I don't know.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. So what I asked Andy about that, and he was basically like, like yeah, like Tony Hawk is definitely the quote unquote the man when it comes to skateboarding. In a bad way, as far as that there are kids even today who who if they want to be really hard skaters, so to speak, they wouldn't touch a Tony Hawk sponsored skateboard and all that stuff. It's seen as uncool in a lot of ways, but he also he was a skateboarder when he was like 13, 14, 15, young, and now his son, who is like 13, is a skateboarder today. And he was like, from that perspective, man, I love Tony Hawk because, like, in my day there was nowhere to skateboard. Like, you would have to find crazy places that were really dangerous, and you know, skateboard illegally till the cops chased you out or whatever. And now there's like crazy skateboard parks for my son to skateboard in, and that's basically because of Tony Hawk. So yeah, so he said that there definitely is that contingent, but from his perspective, you can't deny like the great things that Tony Hawk has done for the sport and all that.
Right, and I mean in the end, like there's a part where it kind of at one moment Toss is like, yeah, because it got mainstreamed and all that stuff. He's like, well, yeah, Tony Hawk won or whatever, sorry, he won or whatever. And he says that, obviously he's pissed off about it still and like doesn't like it, but it's like, yeah, of course he won because you both of them got what they were going for. I mean, like Toss's plan was like anarchy and skating and saying screw you to Money and the Man, and yeah, that's what he got. He got exactly what he was all about, and yeah, you know what? That leads to nothing in the end. I mean, in the end, that's eventually you grow old and it's gone. I mean, that's it. And the only difference was Tony Hawk kind of, yeah, he's still a great skater. He did a bunch of, again, he mainstream skating, and I guess if you're like the, punk rock scene kind of a guy, then yeah, that's what you don't want. But instead he mainstreamed it and he took advantage of it and made a career and life for himself and his family. So yeah, I mean, from my perspective, yeah, good way to go, Tony.
Yeah, and I think a good analogy is someone like Green Day, who's like, okay, like the people who are really into punk probably
right, they do hate Green Day.
But
in fact, yeah, sorry.
But like yeah, I mean at the same time, like how many kids because of Green Day have gone back and bought albums by Minor Threat and Black Flag and all these bands that the true punks do like are definitely benefiting from the fact that there is a Green Day out there.
Sure, absolutely. Again, from my perspective, Green Day is okay. Tony Hawk's okay. They shed light on a cool thing. And why not? You know what I mean? There are tons of people that there's the guys from ESPN and the X Games, the producer of that and the executive producers of that, they don't give a shit about skating, and they never did, and they never will. They care about producing television shows. So, and they got rich, and I have no problem with that. They made a lot of money on it. That's their job. And why not have somebody that actually cared about that? Like, I don't think you can make the argument that Tony Hawk or Green, doesn't care about skating. You can't make the argument that Green Day doesn't care about punk music. They do. They love it. It's part of who they are. So I'm glad that they were able to ride that and take advantage of it.
Yep, absolutely.
So,
but yeah, I definitely thought that whole feud was one of the more interesting parts of the documentary, and I think that we do have a case here where we have kind of an unrelatable narrator in Toss, where I'm not sure like how much of his stuff to believe at some point. You know what I mean? Like a lot of obviously he's telling it from a skewed perspective, and there's a lot of different things, and I'm sure we'll get to some of them. But like one of them, for instance, is moving on just a tiny bit in the narrative. He eventually gets kicked out of XYZ and loses his sponsorship and everything like that. And there's just a weird little comment he makes that they said that his dad embezzled a bunch of money, and like no one else mentions that, and they don't bring that up again. I was like, that's weird. Like, why would they not mention that if that was a thing?
Right. Yeah. Nobody mentions that as the reason that they got rid of Toss, and yeah, that was weird. And actually, I'll rewind all the way to the very intro of the documentary, and I wish I would have written it down, but it's a little narrative from Toss, when they're just rolling the credits, where he does one little thing where he's like, and every story has three sides, my side, your side, and the truth. And then he says something else, but I do remember, because I watched this one twice, and I do remember thinking the second time I watched it, like, yes, you know what? His little narrative in the beginning is just a masterful encapsulation of what this documentary is, and a lot of it is that that you can't really like I don't think Tots is ever lying or anything like that or making it up like when he said they told him his dad embezzled the money. I'm sure he believes that. Was a super strung out druggies recollection of it accurate? I don't know. You know. So yeah, there are a lot of points like that. Even where it's like I wonder how true this story is. I mean, I believe him. I believe he believes what he's telling, but how much truth is there in any of it?
Yeah, and a lot of that totally plays into the Tony Hawk thing too, because like his whole thing is that Tony Hawk was getting like unfair advantages basically in all the competitions, which who knows, maybe he was. I mean, it would make sense for the sport that they want to make a star and stuff like that, so maybe he was, who knows. But then there's the whole thing of like doing the first 900 spin where he's like, yeah, man, I was totally practicing it, and then this guy came and videotaped me, and like Tony Hawk probably studied those tapes or whatever, and then he did it like at the next competition they wouldn't let me skate, which was a really interesting story, and I'm curious like how much of that it might be completely true. I have no idea.
That one that one was actually the most believable story of his that he told, and again I that one I totally believed, and maybe I'm wrong, but for the reason that people in the video actually point out that so I mean obviously the first 900 was a big deal, and I actually watched that on TV. I remember when Tony Hawk did that first 900, and when they pointed it out, and I was like, yeah, think how less meaningful, because like that was like an awesome sports moment. Like I remember it. Like I mean I remember a long time later as a guy that doesn't care that much about skating, but how much would that have lost if it was like, oh, Tony Hawk and this other guy are both trying to do the first 900? Because when you saw in the film footage of Toss trying to do the 900s, I mean, every time you watched him do it, it was like, oh my gosh, he's gonna get it this time. It was so close. It was so incredibly close. And I remember when he tried to do it, Tony Hawk tried to do it. They were like, no one's ever done this before. It's like an impossible thing. Just sitting right next to each other, almost doing it. So yeah, for the showmanship of it, and for like the ESPN had to present it the way they presented it, and obviously like they don't go into how much Toss alienated every relationship in his life, but I bet you he alienated every relationship pretty bad, including those with ESPN and whatever, because he didn't play by the rules. I'm sure they were like, all right, Toss, can you do this? Can you talk to the camera? And I'm sure if he didn't feel like it, he was like, go F yourself, and blah, blah, blah. And they tried to, I'm sure there were days when they tried to film, and they were like, we can't have him on the camera because he's all coked out. And,
Right.
Of course they didn't want him to do the first 900. So yeah, I think that story is probably true.
Yeah, I could buy that.
Yeah.
It definitely was a big moment. I remember seeing, strangely, just a couple weeks ago, I remember seeing some like greatest 20 moments of ESPN history thing, and that was on there. I don't remember what it was, but it was on like the top 20 moments of all time on ESPN. It's definitely a big moment, and like I could see why he's bitter about that, for sure.
Sure, because like, I mean, no, I certainly don't remember anyone saying like, oh, Tony Hawk's gonna try and do the 900. This other guy over here could probably do it too. He was like almost doing it the other day. They obviously is written out of history really, really well.
Right. So at this part of the story, everything falls to shit, and basically.
Right. So I'll just reiterate at this moment in time, at this moment there, Toss wins. Sorry, actually, I guess before the 900, but Toss had won that big tournament. So he and Ben were number 1 and number 2 in the world. Now we come to this part. Toss is back. He suffered an injury, so he couldn't skate for a while. It was a legitimate injury. So basically, there was it was I think 96 that they won they were ranked number 1, number 2 in the world, and basically isn't until 1999 that Tony Hawk does the 900. But it's also like a big jump in their history. They're basically like 96, we're 1 and 2 in the world, and then they're like, and then in 1999, there's like a 3-year break of really anything happening for them. Right. Go ahead and take it from there.
All right, so I'm not sure of the exact sequence of events, but at some point, is this about when Ben has his fateful trip back to Australia?
It is. That is in 1999, and
All
in fact,
right,
it's before the 900 because one of the things Toss says is if he's the first guy to do the 900, it's going to bring in a lot of money,
that's right.
sponsorships, and he can use that money to help Ben.
That's right. So Ben goes back to Australia for some purpose that I don't recall, and he basically gets caught smuggling a bunch of cocaine in his shoe, which is a weird point of order. Like they talk about how the reason he got caught was because it was on his like credit card, like, and then
Right.
later in the movie they bring up again in another incident that they like right away the sensors went off. Like, is there some kind of cocaine center at the airport? What's going on?
Apparently, I was unaware that there was a cocaine sensor, but apparently there is some kind of cocaine detector, I guess. I don't know if it detects other drugs or just cocaine, but because then they actually show a shot of that machine, and it's like this little computer screen, digital screen. All of a sudden, like it says red line goes across it, and it says cocaine. And they're like, wow, guess there's a cocaine sensor.
Guess so. So the biggest bummer of Ben smuggling these drugs is that he's not going to be allowed back in the U.S. So he can't basically be a professional skateboarder anymore. So he can't travel and do international competitions and stuff like that.
Right, right. It seems like not just in the U.S., but I got the impression that his passport was revoked at that point. Can't leave
Right.
Australia, which makes sense. You're an international drug trafficker. They
Right.
revoke your passport,
Yeah. So that's a pretty rough blow for good old Ben.
It
And
is.
yeah, you're right. So that's when um, Tass goes and starts trying to do the 900, doing everything he can to try and raise money and raise awareness and all that stuff, so he can try to do something. I don't know what he's planning to do, but he's planning that if he has a bunch of money, he could probably do something.
Sure. Hire some lawyers, I guess. Whatever.
Yeah. But doesn't happen. Things don't work out for him.
No, they don't.
And I don't know if we want to like go through it and hit every single point of awfulness from here on out, but basically from here on out, it's not good stuff happening to him. He loses his sponsorship. He loses all his friends. Basically, he ends up having a couple kids, and that's the point when he's like, "Yeah, when I had that first kid, that's when I decided my life would be turned around." And then he doesn't get turned around, and then he goes to jail and has another kid somewhere in there, goes to jail again.
No, he just goes to jail the one time. It's
right.
after the second kid. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And yeah, and again, now here's again where this documentary takes another really interesting turn. Is while Toss is running around doing all this stuff. So spoiler alerts if you don't want to have the documentary spoiled for you, plug your ears, I guess. But so
plug your ears until I go. That's
yeah.
the signal that it's all good to listen again.
Yeah, it's a documentary, so you can have spoilers. It doesn't matter. So anyway, so Ben's back in Australia and takes that big blow of essentially going from being ranked the number 2 skater in the world to losing his ability to even compete in the pro circuit. And that's where things really start to go downhill for Ben. So Toss is back, and he's having his life kind of fall apart. He's losing his sponsorships. He's booted. He's blacklisted from all the major circuits. And Ben's back in the United States, or back in Australia, and he is picking up nasty drug habits. And it's crazy because there's so much footage. You actually like watch the progression of his physical state, go through this. There's not much. He doesn't talk much on any of the footage they have, but like you see him like first off, after his arrest, he just kind of goes underground for like 2 years, and then he comes back and he's put on a ton of weight, and he hadn't skated for a long time, just stopped skating altogether. He puts on a ton of weight. He's addicted to Xanax, still doing other drugs. Then he kind of like picks it up a little bit. He starts to skate again. He starts to hang out with some of his older friends. They're kind of good influences on him. And then he gets tangled up with a girl who is a bad influence on him. She's, into heroin, and certainly they enable each other and really get into heroin in a big way. And you watch, he's put on weight, he's taking the Xanax, he's big into that, he's depressed. Then he gets into the heroin, and all of a sudden he gets that heroin look. He gets really gaunt, loses a ton of weight, and you're just kind of watching this in a very intimate manner. I mean, it's not, all this footage isn't like, interview footage on Jay Leno. It's, home video from his friends around him, and he's just going downhill fast. You can just see it in him, and it's kind of at that point that Tass ends up getting arrested in the United States and then set for deportation because he has a domestic violence charge. So they're just like, boom, you're going to be deported to Australia. Plus, I'm sure he probably never bothered to renew his visa or anything like that. So anyway, it gets they never mentioned that, but I'm assuming Tass probably wasn't a big paperwork kind of guy. So he's getting deported back to Australia, loses, his wife and his kids are staying in the United States, so he's already in a bad place there. And then it goes really crazy. So Ben is, again, really bad. He's addicted to heroin. And that girl that is kind of his enabler, his cohort in their drug addiction, he ends up killing her and then trying to dispose of the body. Then, the body is discovered, and they never really say it, but I assume he just kills him. I mean, it's obviously like a suicide. He drowns himself.
Right.
And
so at this point in my notes I wrote, "Whoa, he killed his girl," and then like the next line, "Whoa, he killed himself." I was not expecting the documentary to go there, but yeah, it went pretty dark. I thought maybe he was gonna have an overdose or something since he wasn't talking. He probably. But yeah, I was not expecting the murder-suicide situation.
Right, especially the murder part, because I mean, there was never a part where Tass had always had like this really aggressive, violent, and even when Ben was going downhill, he was just kind of like depressed. You know what I mean? He was just sitting there like depressed, not doing anything, not wanting to do anything. He never showed any signs of violence. And I mean, I guess when you're just like a super junkie, drugged out of your mind, I'm sure you start to lose touch with reality, and whatever, maybe you had some kind of psychosis going on. Obviously, there's other mental issues illnesses that probably help, perpetuate the whole drug addiction. But anyway, through all that, it certainly didn't seem like he was a killer. And his friends said the exact same thing. Like, I mean, like, his friends, Ben's friends, are in the documentary as well, and they're like, you never would have expected that from someone you know. It was shocking to them, even years later, that Ben had killed that girl. Obviously, I would assume he was pretty heavily drugged up when he did it, but still, yeah.
There's some crazy quotes in this movie, and one of the most bizarre quotes I thought was when Tass says, "I knew he was taking Xanax, but he didn't admit taking heroin." That was a strange quote to me. Like they really like play off Xanax as if it's a lot harder drug than I thought it was in this movie. They're always like, yeah, then he popped some Xanax and like kept skating.
Yeah,
I didn't know Xanax was a big like abused drug.
Yeah, I should have Googled. I don't even know what Xanax is, honestly. I think it's an antidepressant, right?
Yeah, it's just an antidepressant. I didn't know that it was even abused. Apparently it is, though. He was doing it.
Right, it's a prescription drug.
Right.
Excuse me. Thank you. But, yeah, so, yeah, they did all kind of, like, act like Xanax was a big thing. Anyway. But they certainly didn't act like Coke was a big thing. That was just... That was just like something you do, Yeah. That's just like part of everyday life.
So, so then Tass comes back to Australia, and it doesn't quite get his life cleaned up right away. He's got some more problems going on, but so like here's kind of what I mean. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff that blew my mind in this, but one thing was that like now he's trying to become a professional skateboarder again, basically. And he's like he's older than us, dude. I don't know. Like it seems like at this point you should be leveraging your knowledge of the skateboarding industry in another way. There's got to be some sort of business type thing that you could do with that knowledge, and obviously that's not. I guess he's not that guy. That's not where his head's at. But I don't know if becoming or rising again in the professional skateboarding industry is the best move.
Right. I mean, like, again, I would assume that's impossible. Because, I think he was born in 1975, so he turns 40 this year. He's trying to reclaim his skateboarding career. I'm going to assume that's impossible, or, certainly very difficult. And, yeah, you're right. And, again, this all goes back to him. Like, because you're right. Like, the obvious choice would be, like, hey, go mend some fences, go use some of those old contacts and like come back and say, hey, I'm sober for the first time in a long time. I'm so sorry that, but now he could start like a skate training camp because he was an amazing skateboarder and whatever, like you said, he could work for probably not ESPN. It seems like they hated him, but do that kind of thing. And he still, again, doesn't have he has like a mental block on so many ways where like you can tell he's not like, boy, yeah, all those drugs are so bad for me. Like, he kind of says that. He kind of alludes to it, but you can tell he's not really like, oh, the problem was when I did that first line of cocaine. That's where my trouble started. He's like, oh, yeah, years later when I got arrested for trafficking cocaine, or, when my brother got arrested for trafficking cocaine, that's when the problem started. Like, no, the problem started a lot sooner than that, buddy.
Right.
But, yeah.
Yeah, and then the documentary ends on kind of a weird note where he's like talking about how he feels like his brother's soul has like come back in the form of his son.
That was
like I mean, I kind of like there's a better way to say that. That I would have been like, okay, fine, but like the way he says it, like it almost seems like he literally believes that that's like it's a reincarnation of his brother or something. It was just weird. It was a weird way he said it.
Yeah, that was a little creepy, but like again, like that one I was really forgiving of because like that was one thing that like a touching moment in the documentary is when Toss talks about when he found out that his brother died. But I mean, like throughout the entire thing, you can tell there's a really deep bond between the brothers. Like he's always like it was us against the world, and it was. I mean, like they spent, they not only grew up together, but they took it a lot farther than most people do. Where his brother followed him across from Australia to the United States, and when they were in the United States, they were always together. They lived together. They worked together. They skateboarded together. They really had a really strong bond. And they had a rough childhood, so it was, they obviously relied on each other a lot. And then that was obviously a huge loss to him. So I forgave the weird creepiness of him mentioning his son might be the incarnation of his brother. But
yeah. Cool. So, anything else on this documentary before we give it our final star ratings?
No. I tried to look up the value of cocaine the best I could because like I was trying to figure out the last thing that like Toss like eventually goes to jail for is he tries to smuggle in 100 grams of cocaine. Of course, I'm American, so 100 grams didn't mean much to me to begin with, and I was thinking like, what was he risking to do? To the best of my abilities on today's standards, it looked like something around $60,000 in cocaine that
nice
he tried to smuggle into the country, give or take.
Lesson not learned from his brother.
Yeah, not at all. Yeah, that was that like a weird psychological thing. Like he just wanted to do the same thing Ben did, and like it was his intention, like his demise. I mean, I don't know. Like the underlying root of what was really going on there, but something was going on that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then at the end, the documentary does take a little bit of a, like with the whole thing with the son, takes a little bit of a behind the music turn where they're like, you know what, now like he's trying to get things on track. But I wish him the best. But part of me was to say that if they kept this documentary going for 2 more years, we'd probably have some more interesting incidents to report.
Probably. It's all, like he did become sober. I mean, he was forced to because he was in jail, but and obviously like he looked the best he ever looked when he gets out of jail. Where you know what I mean? Like you could tell he was like, for drying out and not doing drugs for 3 years, you could tell like was very good for his actual body, both body and mind. And I was like, oh yeah, he's got a shot at it now. But again, he had a couple of opportunities to get out of the life before. We'll see what happens. But
yeah. So if you're watching, Toss, we wish you the best.
We do wish you the best, Toss. I hope you keep your act together and yeah, everything works out great. He had a rough run at it, so he deserves a good turn.
Absolutely. I do not want to see All This Mayhem 2.
No.
Don't make that happen. All right, so how many stars are you going to give this crazy documentary?
I'll give it a solid 4.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wavering between 4 and 5. I don't think it's 5. I'll go with 4. The high end of 4.
Yeah, absolutely.
Teetering.
So,
Cool.
yeah.
All right, so you want to hear what we got up for next week?
Ooh, definitely.
All right. Next week's topic is quirky people.
Okay.
So we got some documentaries about quirky people. First up, we got Queen of Versailles, which is about this family, rich family, who's trying to build the largest single-family home in America, and it's based on Versailles in France. And the wife is quirky.
Okay.
All right. Documentary number 2 is Room 237. And this is the documentary about, basically it's about people's crazy theories on what the movie The Shining means. And like the whole documentary is just these people spouting their crazy theories and like supporting, like trying to defend their theories about like one guy, for instance, believes that it's Stanley Kubrick's confession that he helped fake the moon landing. And he like shows all this evidence throughout the movie, throughout The Shining, of why he believes this. That I have seen this movie, and I'm going to give you fair warning that I think you might hate it. So I'm just going to say that just because I feel like you're like a guy who wants a concrete, meaning it may not put up with the BS of these crazy theories. But it is a very interesting documentary, and I did like it, so I want to put it on the list. And could be interesting to talk about. I don't know. Final documentary is the Galapagos Affair, which is the story. I believe it's the story of like some British settlers who come, I think like in the 1920s maybe, and start like this colony in the Galapagos Islands, and everything goes crazy and horribly wrong. This documentary is directed by the same guy who directed Something Ventured, which we reviewed.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen it, but it's supposed to be good. So those are my 3 picks for you, Jonathan. What say you to those quirky selections?
Boy, tough choices. Queen of Versailles I'm definitely interested in because I love real estate and I love the idea of the crazy excess to try and get a feel for it. Room 237 definitely piques my interest because I've stayed in the Stanley Hotel.
Nice.
It's up in Estes Park in Colorado. My wife and I have stayed there, and it's I've done the ghost tour. It's kind of a cool place. It's definitely got a cool vibe to it, so I'd kind of like to see that. And I think I'm going to scratch the Galapagos Affair because you didn't sell it very well. And in fact,
I was resting on the idea that it was directed by the Something Ventured.
All I know is
I put too much stake in there.
Yeah. You just said crazy British settlers on the Galapagos Islands. Although I have a feeling they probably wipe out the dodo bird, but whatever. I'm gonna go with Queen of Versailles. I'd like to see an eccentric bunch of crazy people try and build an elaborate house.
All right.
See what that's about.
I think that's a good selection. All right, so next week we will be back to discuss The Queen of Versailles. It's on Netflix. Go watch it and come talk to us about it next week. Until then, this is PT. Keep it real.
This is Jonathan. We'll see you next week.